Good morning. On behalf of the LCSFC study team, I'm very pleased to share with you some of our key findings from the study, which has been implemented for the past 8 years, since 2016 up until the latest round, which I'll be reporting on, which was completed in 2024. Before I begin, let me just quickly do a brief introduction of the LCSFC study team. From the OPS, we have Dr. Nanette Mayol, who's also the co-investigator of the study. Professor Frank Largo, the OPS director, also very much involved in the study. We have Dr. Chona Chavez of the Research Institute for Mindanao Culture. We have Dr. Fiscalina Nolasco of the Center for Social Research and Education. And I hope she's here, Dr. Elma Laguna of the Demographic Research and Development Foundation of the UP Population Institute. Our policy analysts are Professor John Aligado of UP Cebu, and of course we have Professor Alex Serin of OPS. As earlier mentioned by our previous speakers, now that we're approaching the end, 2030 end line of the SDGs, it's really vital that we assess where our youth are in terms of human capital foundation, particularly in terms of achieving the SDG targets on education and youth development. As earlier mentioned by Vina, this particular cohort is important, particularly their human capital development, as far in terms of allowing us to claim that demographic dividend that given the rise in the critical mass of young people. We've had some glimpse or some ideas of how our youth is faring in terms of education from the series of EDCOM2 reports, and which revealed that most Filipino students suffer in basic proficiencies, particularly in terms of their performance in standardized tests. We also learned from the report that there are certain background factors that are relevant in defining their schooling out performance, such as parental involvement, stunting. And one other factor that came out that even did a lot of press was the negative effect of bullying on schooling outcomes. In fact, our study team actually wrote a discussion paper on this, looking at bullying inside and outside school and their effects on school performance. And among the important findings is that bullying outside the school, in fact, bullying in the homes has actually a more significant impact on schooling. And that certain background factors, with or without bullying, define school performance. One important key takeaway from this is that while the school milieu is very important in defining the learning experience, like curriculum infrastructure and the school environment, it's also as important to look at the wider ecosystem that the youth is involved in. For instance, how are their families like? What enabling environment is provided for them in terms of schooling? What are their experiences as they go through the process of adolescence, as they go through puberty, as they grow, as they mature? How are these experiences affecting their schooling performance through the years? And how are their communities like? Are they getting support from the community? So this is where, as Venus mentioned earlier, this is where the LCSFC data play a very important role in defining, giving us a better picture, more comprehensive scenario of the school environment of our adolescents. You've already seen this in Vina's earlier presentation. So, as earlier mentioned, the LCSFC is designed to collect data on a nationally representative sample of Filipinos who transition from childhood to young adulthood in the course of the SDG implementation period. So we'll call them the SDG generation. So, and as Vina also put it earlier, this is the youth that puts a human face to the progress of the SDGs. The LCSFC tracks key milestones in the lives of these youth, from their pubertal transition, through their schooling trajectories, in their entries as well as exits in the workforce, as well as in sexual reproductive health experiences, and as they start engaging in transitions that lead to adulthood. So for this morning's presentation, I will focus on data that we've gathered from waves 1 to 7. We've had 7 full surveys with available data. This is from ages 10 to 18. Because of the differences in data collection period, some of the waves actually, in some of the waves, the cohort straddled 2 ages. And so in 2024, the cohort was between the 17 and 18. But for purposes of discussion, we refer to the oldest integer age as a point of reference. So for my presentation, I'll be describing key components of human capital, mainly education, and our strategy is to approach, is examining, use education as a point of reference for the wider context of their life course as they move on from adolescence to working age. So I'll be discussing their life transitions, life aspirations, their mental health status, their adolescent pregnancy and early union, and as well as community safety nets and how all these are linked to educational performance. Let's begin with their schooling trajectories from age 10 to 18. So this slide shows the last grade completed at each wave. I hope you can see the numbers clearly. So the numbers in bold, from looking at the numbers in bold, you'll see that about 90% of the cohort actually tracked cleanly over time. So by baseline or wave 1, the cohort has completed grades 3 and 4. And they follow, in this particular group, in bold font, follow quite cleanly, track cleanly over time. And we missed a school year between waves 5 and 6, that's why there's a gap. But also note that along the margins, there are those who are lagging behind. So by age 18, if you summarize the data in terms of last grade completed, whether they're enrolled or in that wave or not, there are about 1% who have just reached elementary education, and about 9% who are between grades 7 to 9. There were about 30% who completed junior high school, and the majority were in senior high school. Completed either grades 11 or 12. So among those enrolled at age 18, 90% were in senior high school, And the majority, actually, 7 in 10 chose the academic track. And compared to the boys, a higher proportion of the girls chose to be in the academic track over TVL. These are the 2 more common tracks. And the reverse is seen among the boys. And when they were asked why they choose these tracks, about the majority said that it was really of their interest, or this is in line with their planned course in college. But note that there's also about 19% who just copied from their friends or weren't really decided on which track to take. I think these are the proportion that we need to pay more attention to. About 9% also said that they had no choice, but this is the only track that's available in their schools. So in terms of tracking their enrollment rates from ages 10 to 18, you'll see that, let me begin with the overall enrollment trend. You'll see that almost everyone was enrolled in school at age 10. However, as they get older, by age 18, it's now down to about 86%, 89%. However, girls tend to have a higher proportion of girls that were in school over time compared to the boys. So by age 18, 93% of the girls were still enrolled in school versus only about 85% among the boys. So you also notice in the previous slide that there's a significant, sorry. Oh, I had to go back. Oh. Can you go back to the slide on enrollment rates? Anyway, you'll see that there's a significant, the slide before this. There's a significant drop in enrollment rate between age 16 and 18. And looking further into this, you see that at age 16, about half of the girls who were not in school were not enrolled because they were pregnant or with child. And then about half of the boys at age 16 were not interested in schooling. And still a high proportion at age 18 of the boys were not interested. And also by age 18, almost double the proportion of girls reported having financial difficulties. I think this may be because they've already started their families. So when we look further into why they were not interested in schooling, most of their responses included that they did not understand what's being taught, they had difficulty in schooling, they were too lazy, or that they would prefer to work. Work actually was one of the reasons, particularly for the boys, for not being enrolled in school. So these are some of the red flags that I think need to be paid attention to. So while enrollment rates and completed grades provide important indicators of education, they don't tell us whether they're in their schooling pace or whether they're in schedule, whether they're on track in terms of their education. So we created the variable called being on track with schooling, which means that they started grade 1 at the right age, that's before or on or before age 7, and that they have not missed a school year or have repeated a school year. So let's take a look at the general trend in being on track with schooling. So at age 10, about 91% were off track. or on track with schooling. And this is a diminishing variable. So in other words, once you're off track at age 10, you're off track for the rest of your schooling career. So this is by age 18, about 76% were classified as on track. So we're missing about 24%. There are about 24% who are off track. But if you look at the trend among girls, you see that a higher proportion than the general average are on track compared to the boys. So in all these schooling indicators, the girls outperform the boys. And other than the boys, we also found disadvantages in terms of schooling for the marginalized adolescents. So we'll group the baseline sample into marginalized status. So about 2.6% were with disability. The top 5 disabilities reported were visual impairments, hearing impairments, speech, physical, as well as intellectual impairments. And about 6% experienced armed conflict in the last 3 years at age 10. 9% belong to indigenous populations, and 4% were GIDA residents. So, and but 78% were none of belong to none of these categories, so they're non-marginalized. So these are exclusive categories, because I'd like to point out that among there are about 22% who are with marginalities. About 10% had multiple vulnerabilities, actually. They could be with disability and belong to IPs. And so for the purposes of this analysis, we group them into the more severe form of marginality, in which is with disability. So if you look at their tracking rates for the non-marginalized, you see that it sort of mimics the general cohort sample. However, the most disadvantaged are those with disabilities. No, they're really lagging behind. Next are those from indigenous peoples. And then we have those who were exposed to armed conflict in the past 3 years at baseline. And then the GIDA sample were actually not too far off from the non-marginalized. No. We also examined, compared the on-track with schooling rates between the LGBTs, also maybe also considered among the marginalized versus the non-LGBT. And I think later this afternoon we'll have more information on this from the presentations this afternoon. And so at age 16, about 84%, it was in wave 6 or at age 16 that we first asked questions on gender expression and gender identity, sexual orientation and all that. And so at age 16, 84% identified to be straight, and about 60% identified themselves to be LGBTQ+. So if you look at the on-track with schooling rates, first we start with the non-LGBT. Again, it sort of mimics the general population. It's just lower percentage at age 10, because this is a sample that's limited to those with data at age 16. But more or less it follows the general trend, overall trend. However, if you compared the LGBTQ trend, you see that while they sort of off similarly, they start to fall behind by age 18. And this is the non-LGBT. So we examined, in the report, we examined various schooling performance indicators, such as I've already seen enrollment rates, being on track with schooling, and schooling transitions, in order to find out what factors are associated with these schooling outcomes. So the models for enrollment, so we did a longitudinal model for enrollment status, and over time to get on average, the factors that are associated with being enrolled or not in a particular wave. And we also did cross-sectional models for being on track with schooling, and they have commonalities for these two schooling outcomes. Among those positively associated were, of course, cognitive endowment, IQ scores, which is expected. Early schooling was positively associated with being in school as well as being on track. And a simple thing as aspiring for college actually was a very important factor, significant factor in getting them on track or being in school, staying in school. Doing any reading, there were more boys who did less reading than girls. And this particular variable was significant predictor of the schooling outcomes. Household parents' education, for those with parents with at least high school education, were more on track with schooling. And as important as the child's aspiration for college, the parents' aspirations for their children to attain a college education was as important in predicting good schooling outcomes. Those in the Visayas, compared to those residing in Luzon and Visayas, actually had better schooling performance. Among the negative factors were, of course, being male, as you've already seen earlier, and having behavioral and emotional problems early on in childhood. Those with disability, stunting, and those exposed to work, especially those exposed to child work. And we also found a negative association between the number of hours spent online as well as the number of social media accounts with enrollment as well as being on track status. Poverty, of course, was also a negative predictor, and belonging to indigenous peoples. And those who are urban residents are less likely to be doing well in school compared to those in rural areas, and those exposed to armed conflict areas, as you've seen, tend to be disadvantaged. We also looked at the use a sequential logit model or a continuation ratio model to predict the odds of completing a particular grade level and moving on to the next level. So from our analysis, it showed that it doesn't take much to complete the elementary level, except of course if you are with disability and among those who are urban residents. It is the transition from completing junior high school and moving on to senior high school, which have more factors that's underlying this particular transition. So in other words, this is the transition that perhaps we need to pay more attention to. So once they've passed through junior high school, the more fundamental variables such as parents' education, being male, stunting, and belonging to indigenous populations are the ones affecting this particular transition. So let's look at their aspirations in life. I've already mentioned this earlier. as a significant indicator of good schooling outcomes. And so this graph shows the different groups. So we have the male and female on the first two columns, and then they have the marginal status, marginal groups, and then the non-LGBT and the LGBT. So in general, as they got older, their desire to complete college, reach college level, actually increased by age 18 compared to when they were age 10. Except for the girls. There was a slight decrease in the proportion of girls wanting to complete college, to reach college level. To also get an idea on what their work prospects are, we also did an analysis on work values, whether they value work or regular employment in the future, and what kind of work they would like to have as they get older. So at age 10, they really had lofty ideas about being pilots, architects. So most of the boys want to be policemen. And this is right when we did the baseline study, this is when that popular soap opera, Provinciano, was very popular. And the girls wanted to be teachers. However, over time, you'll see that by age 18, the desire to work in jobs that require college-level degrees actually decreased. No? So as reality set in, no? Given the realities in their lives, they change course, no? They change aspirations over time. Our mental health data are from the ACIBA set of instruments, such as the Child Behavior Checklist and the Youth Self-Report. And from these, among the data or variables that you can derive from these instruments is the total problem scale score. This is the sum of the responses in behavioral, that deals with behavioral, emotional, and social problems. So the higher the score, the more problematic, the more inclined to have emotional or behavioral problems. And so if you look at the bar graph shows the mean scores, and so we measured the total problem. We have data on the total problem scale scores from age 11, 15, 13, and 15. And you'll see that for the older ages, girls had a higher mean scores than boys. However, the CIBA scoring system is such a way that they do gender norming. And so they have a different cutoff for males because of differences in behavioral patterns. And so for males, the cutoffs are lower. So it takes a lower score for males to be classified as a more severe problem level. So the problem score scales can also be stratified into normal, borderline, and clinical. So it takes a lower score for boys to fall under the more severe problem scales categories such as borderline and clinical. So you'll see that on the right-hand side that males actually have a high proportion of males actually have scores that fall under the clinical range. So this is not a diagnostic instrument, but having scores fall under the clinical range may be indicative that the symptoms being experienced or manifested may actually be truly symptomatic. And a subset of the total problem scores are the depression, anxiety scores. And so the next series of slides show the factors that increase the risk of being categorized as either borderline or clinical levels in all these measures. So for the total problem score, exposure to domestic violence. In our analysis, adverse childhood exposure which we define as exposure to domestic violence, violence from parents, as well as poverty, are strongly associated with mental health problems during adolescence. And not having parents or just having one parent in the household was predictive of being classified under as severe. Urban residents and more hours online, as well as more social media accounts. At age 18, about 11% were classified as within the clinical range, and being male was of a higher risk than females. Those with higher IQ scores, and our psychologist consultant explained this as those with higher IQ scores being more competitive and therefore being more anxious, and exposure to domestic violence once again, and similar to the total problem scores, parental presence, as well as social media exposure. At age 18, about 12% was classified as under the clinical range, and being off track with schooling was associated with depression, urban residents, and also more hours online. And then we looked into early sexual initiation, pregnancy, and union. Again, we first asked questions on these variables in wave 6 or at age when the cohort was age 16. And so the next series of slides to data from when they were age 16. So about 8% reported to have experienced sexual intercourse, a higher proportion among boys reporting this than girls. And by age 16, at that age, but the mean age at first sex was 14.6. And as we proceed with the further waves, this value will of course change. And what's important that we'd like to always stress when we present these findings is that among the girls, the first sexual partners appear to be much older than them compared to the sexual partners of the boys. And I think that's an important red flag in terms of, remember, these are really very young girls and dealing with very sexually experienced and maybe more mature or been older sexual partners. They may lose out in terms of the negotiation when it comes to and also when it comes to contraceptive use or protection. So about 2.5% of the girls at age 16 reported to have ever been pregnant. And most of these happened between the ages of 15 and 16. And those who had sex by age 16 were more likely to get pregnant. So it's early sex was a strong determinant of pregnancy. So out of the 96 females who had initiated sex, 58 got pregnant. And this is more because they did not use any form of protection or any contraception against pregnancy. And for the majority, they said they did not use any protection because they did not expect to have sex at that time. There were also boys, 1.6% of the boys reported to have gotten someone pregnant at age 16. And there were 41 males who reported this. 13 have ever been in union, and 9 were currently in union. So when the studies have shown that pregnancy is an important precursor of early union among the girls, it may not be so much so no, for the males. So as of age 16, about 2% have ever been in union, with a higher proportion among females than males. And the mean age at first union was again at 15. And again, I'd like to point out that the first union partner for the girls tends to be much older. So again, we have that dynamics that we might need to worry about. And who are at risk of SEFMU, aside from being female, those who are poorer, those who are off track with schooling at age 10, those who have less educated mothers, and those who have fewer parents at home at age 10. So if you look at their school performance of those who are in union or ever had experience with pregnancy, you'll see that there's certainly more disadvantage. So the top two graph compares the never cohabited, the proportion in school at age 16 among the never cohabited and the ever cohabited, and you see the distinct disadvantage among those who have ever cohabited. You see the same story between the males who have ever gotten a girl pregnant and those who have gotten a girl pregnant, and those who have never been pregnant, and the females who have experienced pregnancy have lower enrollment rates. You see the same patterns in terms of being on track with schooling. So this is also indicates, and shown by other analyses, that they were more likely to be off track in schooling as early as age 10. There also you see the same trend in terms of aspirations for college degrees as well at age 16. In terms of their community safety nets, only about half of the cohort were exposed to barangays with government-funded scholarships. And with the most number of, by wave 7, it was the Visayas with the most number of cohort exposed to public scholarships. In terms of poverty alleviation programs outside the 4 Ps, but only a third were exposed to such programs. But then it's important to note that at baseline, about 47% of the cohort were 4 Ps beneficiaries. We also have a significant rise in the proportion of barangays having adolescent programs from wave 1, which is in 2016, to wave 4 in 2020. So a higher proportion of the adolescents were exposed to adolescent programs, pregnancy programs, by the time they turned 13. So in summary, what's the state of the Filipino youth in terms of education? At age 10, the enrollment rate was almost universal. However, by age 18, only 89% were in school. So there's a significant dropout rate. The lack of interest in schooling, financial problems, pregnancy, as well as work were among the top reasons for not enrolling. At age 18, 24% were actually off track with schooling. And that girls overall perform better in schooling than boys, and that marginalized adolescents are at risk of being behind in schooling. And then it's also what important finding that we point out in the studies, that there are childhood as well as adolescent factors that determine how these adolescents fare in terms of schooling. So for instance, exposure to domestic and parental violence. We'll have another session on this afternoon, which looks at this more deeply. Are associated with emotional and behavioral problems, which in turn are negatively affect school performance. Aspirations for college education, just dreaming for having a college degree, may be an important predictor of good school performance. Parents play an important role, not just with their own educational background, but also in terms of promoting better schooling performance in their children. Of course, adolescent pregnancy and early union are clear deterrents to being on track with schooling. And adolescents, as we've seen, have insufficient exposure to safety nets in the community. And in the next coming rounds of the LCSFC, we're now looking into the adolescents at ages 19 and over. And as now they're more and more more engaged in the labor force. and in the labor market. And the question arises as to what extent will girls hold their edge over boys in terms of human capital development. In terms of schooling performance, we see that they're performing so much better than boys over time from ages 10 to 18. However, we've seen the some glimpses of possible threats to this edge. But by age 18, a slight proportion of girls aspiring for college, there was fewer girls aspiring for college by age 18 compared to when they were age 10. And in terms of work aspirations, girls are less likely to aspire for jobs with college degrees. And of course, there's the threat of adolescent pregnancy and CEFMU that are likely to also threaten their being on track with schooling. I think that's my last slide, and then I guess I end here. Thank you.